Okay, so we've got our weapons firing correctly, but one thing that feels a little bit off is the fact that as you're shooting your gun, it kind of feels like things just magically appear where you're pointing. There's no real feeling that the actual gun model in the bottom right of the screen is doing anything. So to fix that, we're going to add something called a muzzle flash. So a muzzle flash is the bright bit of light that kind of emits from the end of the gun when you're firing the gun. So for that, what we're going to do is stop this running here. And I'm going to go into my models folder here. And here we have a muzzle flash model. And I'm going to drag this into our scene here. It's appearing way off in the distance there a little bit. Let's put this at 000 like so. And we're going to put this around here. And what we're going to do is make this appear at the end of each of our guns. So let's start off with our pistol. I'm going to get this. I'm going to make this a child of the pistol itself. I'm going to rotate it around 180 here. Then I'm going to drag this up and put it right at the end of the object here. So there we go, around about there. Down a little bit. And this is something that we're just basically going to make it so that it will turn on and off whenever we fire our bullet. It'll only appear for basically a frame of our game, a very tiny little fraction of time. But it just adds a lot of feeling to how our guns fire. So we've got one there. Let's do the same for each of our other weapons. I'm going to hit Control and C on this. Then I'm going to turn off that pistol, turn on our machine gun. I'm going to select the blaster and then hit Control and V. And it'll place a copy of whatever we copied beside whatever object we have selected. So that's why we select the child of the gun itself. So let's take our muzzle flash then and let's just line this up. So roughly about here. That looks about right. It's centered enough. That'll do. There we go. So we'll do the same thing again then. Hide our machine gun. Turn on our rifle. Paste that in there. Let's go to the end here. Let's make sure we're at the right height roughly. A little bit down. And there we go. Okay, so that's our muzzle flash setup on our 3 different guns. Then for each of these guns, they're obviously going to need a reference to their individual muzzle flash. So let's go back into our gun script. I'm going to create a public game object called muzzle flash. And we'll save that. And then back in here, we're going to assign that to each of those. So our pistol, put that one in there. Machine gun, that one in there. And rifle, that one in there. Okay, so for each of these muzzle flashes as well, we also want to make sure they're deactivated. We don't want them active in our scene. And now when I turn on pistol, just by default, there we go. We don't see it just yet. So now we need to make it so that that muzzle flash will appear. Let's save this. Let's go back into our script and our player controller. And whenever we shoot our gun, at the bottom here, we're going to say all guns at selected gun dot muzzle flash dot set active true. So we're activating that shot. And obviously at the moment we're just activating it here. So we need a way to deactivate that. So how we'll deactivate it is just by scrolling up here. And where we have our shooting happening, where am I looking? I'm here. I was looking at the wrong thing altogether. Just before we have our shooting happening, we're going to say deactivate the muzzle flash. So we're going to say all guns selected gun dot muzzle flash dot set active false. So why are we doing this? Well, or sorry, not why are we doing this? Why are we doing this here specifically? Why are we doing it before we actually shoot the gun? Well, think about what happens logically. If your game is running along, you go through the update loop, we get down to here, ignore this for the moment, but we get down to here and we shoot our gun. So what happens is we shoot our gun and the muzzle flash gets deactivated. And that's great. So it continues on and does the rest of the update loop. And then the next time around, it comes down to here and says, oh, on the last frame, we showed, or we made the muzzle flash be active. Now that we've got to here, we can deactivate the muzzle flash. So that means that for one whole frame of the game, the muzzle flash was activated. So that's a way to keep the muzzle flash like actually active for a brief moment of time. So let's go back into our game and see this in action. So we'll let that compile. And then when I play, we see our little muzzle flash appear for a brief moment. Let's switch to our machine gun here. You'll see it pops up for just a fraction of a second and then it disappears. And for the moment, that is great. Now, for me right now, it's being very, very consistent. And that's because if I go up here to my graphics settings, I have VSync turned on, which means it keeps the frame rate at a steady amount relative to what my screen is displaying. So my screen is displaying like 60 frames a second, I think, or something like that. But what that means is it's very easily able to keep track of what is displaying. If I turn this off, so actually if I just go over here to my stats, you'll see, hey, the graphics are showing at 60 frames per second. If I go and turn off VSync, suddenly my frame rate is really high, but my actual screen is still only showing 60 frames a second. So now if I fire, I am not seeing that muzzle flash at all. I think I saw, there we go, I saw 2 brief flickers of it there for a second. I don't even know if that'll show up in the capture of the video or not, but it doing that is not great. Obviously we want to actually be able to see that, and the reason that that's happening, I'm going to turn my VSync back on, is because the game was running at 400 frames a second there, and basically what happens is, hey, it gets activated and then it gets to here and says, oh, we're deactivating it, but all of that is within 2 frames which didn't even show up on my screen. So that's not great. It works really well for when we have a VSync applied, but if you don't have VSync in your game, if you're allowing your players to use whatever frame rate they want, then that's not going to work very, very well. So what we'll do is we're going to add a very small value to this to allow us to wait a tiny, tiny fraction of time and then hide the muzzle flash. So let's go back up to the top here and let's put this in the section where we're tracking some gun values here. We're going to add a public float muzzle display time, and then we'll have a private float for muzzle counter, we'll call it. And then what we're going to do is whenever we shoot our gun down here, and when we activate our muzzle, we'll say muzzle counter equals muzzle display time. And then up here where we're deactivating it, we're going to count down with that counter. So what we're going to do is first of all say we're going to check if that muzzle is currently active in our scene. So if all guns selected gun dot muzzle flash dot active in hierarchy. Active in hierarchy is how we can check if it's currently activated in our scene. And if that's true, we'll make our muzzle counter count down. So muzzle counter minus equals time.delta time. Now the reason we do this check is because we don't need to be making this count down if there's no muzzle flash currently active. There's no reason for this to be constantly going. So we make it count down, and then if our muzzle counter is less than or equal to 0, well that means it's counted down, so we can deactivate the flash. So let's save this. Let's go back into Unity. And if we go to our player, we need to assign a value to that muzzle display time. And I purposely didn't do this back in our script because we're going to do something or to demonstrate something that's really handy to do in Unity, which is I want this muzzle flash to last roughly 1/60th of a second, because my game is targeting running at 60 frames a second. So I want that muzzle flash to last for 1/60th of a second. Now you could set a specific value if you wanted here. Maybe a good one would be about 0.02, because we have 0.1 between each shot. So 0.02 would last long enough maybe for a muzzle flash. But what I want to do is say, I want this to happen in 1/60th of a second. So I can type in here 1 divided by 60. and hit enter, and Unity will calculate the value that we want in here. So it's a really handy thing. You can do very basic math functions within a variable that you have here. And that's a really handy and powerful thing to be able to do, especially when you start moving things around. Sometimes you want it to go in equal increments, and you can say, hey, I want this to be 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, whatever. So with that in place, then let's go ahead and play our game. And now, well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deactivate these stats. I don't really want to see them in action. But now when I fire my gun, we very consistently have our muzzle appearing. But obviously we still had this previously with our VSync. So let's go up here. I'm going to turn off VSync, and now I still have the muzzle flash lasting the amount of time I want it to appear, and it's appearing consistently on my screen. So perfect. There we go. That's our muzzle flash working exactly the way we want to. Actually, there's one final thing we want to do with that. Let me turn off this, or turn this VSync back on again. If I go back into my script, there's one edge case that we want to allow for, which is that if we do a shot and then immediately switch weapons, basically on the exact same frame, there's a chance that a shot can fire, a muzzle be turned on, and then we switch to a new gun, which is great. But when we then go back and switch to the same gun that we did our shot with, the muzzle would still be activated, and then when we switch back to it, it'll do its countdown to deactivate the muzzle. So basically you would switch back to the weapon, and for some reason there'd be a flash at the front of the gun, which obviously wouldn't be great. So we're just going to make sure when we switch our gun, so we'll go down to a switch gun here, whenever we switch the gun, we make sure that all guns, selected gun, dot muzzle flash set active false. So we're always making sure that we deactivate the muzzle flash when we switch to a new weapon. And that's it. That's our muzzle flash working correctly.